The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Michael Harrison adjusted his black robes as he settled into his leather chair, preparing for another routine day of traffic violations and minor offenses. At 52, he had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as a strict but fair judge in the Philadelphia Municipal Court. The clock struck 9:30 a.m., and the courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Court officers directed people to their seats, papers rustled, and whispered conversations filled the air. Judge Harrison glanced at his docket, noting that he had 20 cases to handle before lunch. Case number 2374, Sarah Thompson, traffic violation, announced the court clerk, her voice clear and professional. A well-dressed black woman in her mid-30s approached the podium. Sarah Thompson stood out from the usual traffic offenders. She wore a crisp navy blazer over a white blouse, her natural hair styled professionally, and carried herself with quiet confidence. In her hand, she held a leather portfolio containing her documents. Judge Harrison looked down at the citation. "Miss Thompson, you're here for running a red light at the intersection of Maple and 5th Street on April 15th at 8:45 p.m. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady and articulate. "While I acknowledge being present at that intersection, I believe there are extenuating circumstances that I'd like to explain." The judge nodded, maintaining his usual stern expression. He'd heard countless excuses over the years, and while he always listened, few truly warranted special consideration. Sarah continued, "I was returning from the hospital where my mother had just been admitted for emergency surgery. I distinctly remember the light changing from yellow to red as I entered the intersection. I made a split-second decision based on the emergency of my situation." Judge Harrison noticed something different about this defendant. Her explanation wasn't delivered with the usual nervousness or defensive tone he typically encountered. Instead, she spoke with the clarity and precision of someone used to presenting arguments. "Do you have any documentation regarding your mother's hospital admission?" he asked, maintaining his professional demeanor. Sarah opened her portfolio and retrieved a hospital admission form. The court officer collected it and presented it to the judge. The documentation confirmed her story. Her mother had indeed been admitted to Mercy Hospital at 8:30 p.m. that evening. Still, Judge Harrison had to consider the law. Running a red light, regardless of circumstances, posed a danger to other drivers. He had always believed in consistency in his rulings, feeling it was the cornerstone of justice. "Miss Thompson, while I sympathize with your situation, traffic laws exist to protect all citizens. Running a red light puts other drivers at risk, regardless of the circumstances." He paused, shuffling the papers before him. "I'm going to find you guilty of the violation, with a fine of $150. Sarah's expression remained composed, though something flickered in her eyes, not anger or frustration, but something closer to disappointment. She nodded respectfully. "I understand, Your Honor. Thank you for hearing my explanation." As she turned to leave, Judge Harrison noticed a familiar book peeking out of her portfolio, The Justice Code, a legal thriller he'd co-written under a pseudonym with an online writing partner he'd never met. The sight gave him a moment's pause, but he quickly dismissed it as a coincidence. Many lawyers and legal professionals read that genre. "Next case," he called out, already focusing on the following defendant. Sarah Thompson walked out of the courtroom with deliberate steps, her head held high. The morning sun caught her face as she passed through the beam of light from the windows, and for a brief moment, Judge Harrison felt an inexplicable sense of unease, as if he'd missed something important. The rest of the morning proceeded as usual, with Judge Harrison handling each case with the same measured approach that had earned him respect in the legal community. Yet, occasionally, his mind would drift back to the woman with the legal thriller in her bag, though he couldn't explain why. Little did he know that this routine traffic court appearance would soon turn his world upside down, challenging everything he thought he knew about himself and his approach to justice. 2 days after the courtroom incident, Judge Michael Harrison wheeled his carry-on suitcase through the bustling lobby of the Grand Chicago Hotel. The excitement of the annual Literary Writers' Conference made his heart beat faster, though he'd never admit such enthusiasm to his judicial colleagues. Here, he wasn't Judge Harrison, he was simply Michael, one half of the best-selling writing duo Harrison Wells. The hotel's crystal chandeliers sparkled above him as he checked in, and the smell of fresh coffee wafted from the hotel's cafe. Riders of all ages filled the space, many wearing conference badges that dangled from blue lanyards around their necks. Michael collected his own badge from the registration desk, carefully arranging it so his photo was visible. For 3 years, he had collaborated online with a writing partner known to him only as S.T. Wells. Together, they had produced 2 successful legal thrillers, with their 3rd book due to be released next month. Their partnership worked perfectly. He provided the technical courtroom details, while S.T. brought the emotional depth that made their characters come alive. Michael checked his watch. 2:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, he would finally meet S.T. Wells in person. They had agreed to meet at the hotel's rooftop garden, a quiet spot away from the conference crowds. His writing partner had suggested the location, saying they'd recognize each other by wearing matching blue scarves, a simple but effective plan. As he rode the elevator to the top floor, Michael straightened his blue scarf and rehearsed his greeting. He had imagined this meeting countless times, picturing S.T. as a middle-aged man, probably another legal professional, given their extensive knowledge of courtroom procedures. The rooftop garden was a peaceful oasis above the city's noise. Potted plants created small, private areas between comfortable seating arrangements, and a glass enclosure protected visitors from the Chicago wind while offering stunning views of the skyline. A few conference attendees sat scattered around, typing on laptops or engaged in quiet conversations. Michael chose a seat near the entrance, where he could easily spot anyone wearing a matching scarf. He pulled out his phone, checking their last email exchange to confirm the meeting time. The familiar ping of a new message caught his attention. It was from S.T. "Almost there. Blue scarf as promised. Can't wait to finally meet." He smiled, feeling both nervous and excited. Their online partnership had produced not just successful books, but what he considered a genuine friendship. They had shared ideas, debated plot points, and supported each other through writing blocks and personal challenges, all without ever knowing each other's true identity. The elevator doors opened, and Michael looked up expectantly. His heart stopped. Walking through the door was Sarah Thompson, the woman he had found in his courtroom just 2 days ago. She wore a professional black dress, and around her neck was a blue scarf identical to his. Their eyes met, and he watched as recognition dawned on her face. The confident smile she had worn while entering the garden faltered for just a moment. Michael stood up automatically, his legal training and courtroom etiquette kicking in despite his shock. "Judge Harrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same composed tone he remembered from the courtroom. "Or should I say, Harrison of Harrison Wells?" Michael struggled to find words. The brilliant writing partner he had worked with for 3 years, the person whose insights had helped shape their compelling narratives about justice and redemption, was the same woman he had found without a second thought. "Miss Thompson, you're S.T. Wells," he finally managed to say. "Sarah Thompson Wells," she confirmed, taking a seat across from him. The carefully arranged plants around them created an intimate space that suddenly felt too small. "I must admit, this isn't quite how I imagined our first meeting would go." The irony of their situation hung heavy in the air. Their latest manuscript, sitting in both their laptops, dealt with themes of prejudice and assumptions in the justice system. Now, they found themselves living a scene that could have been pulled from their own pages. Michael looked at the woman before him, not as a judge viewing a defendant, but as a writer seeing his partner for the first time. The realization of his own biases began to sink in, creating a knot in his stomach that wouldn't easily unwind. An uncomfortable silence stretched between Sarah Thompson and Judge Michael Harrison as they sat in the rooftop garden. The beautiful Chicago skyline seemed to fade into the background as they faced this unexpected moment. The blue scarves they both wore, meant to be symbols of their partnership, now felt like reminders of the complicated situation they found themselves in. "Would you like some coffee?" Michael finally asked, trying to break the tension. His voice wasn't as confident as it usually was in the courtroom. "I believe we have a lot to talk about." Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Coffee would be good, Judge Harrison. Black, no sugar, just like the characters drink in Chapter 3 of our second book." As Michael signaled a nearby server, he couldn't help but notice how different Sarah looked from his courtroom encounter. Away from the formal setting of the courthouse, she carried herself with even more confidence. Her natural hair was styled differently, and she wore a stylish blazer that spoke of success rather than someone appearing before a judge. The server brought their coffees, and Sarah took a slow sip before speaking. You know, I've been sitting on this irony for the past 2 days. The man who fined me without a second thought is the same person who spent 3 hours last week debating with me about making our protagonists more empathetic to minority defendants. Michael winced at her words. He remembered that discussion well. They had exchanged lengthy emails about bringing more diversity and understanding to their latest novel. Sarah, about the traffic violation. Please, she interrupted, raising her hand. Let's not pretend this is just about a traffic ticket. We both know it's about something much bigger. She pulled out her laptop and opened it to their current manuscript. Look at this passage we wrote together last month. She turned the screen toward him, and Michael read their own words. Justice isn't just about following the letter of the law. It's about seeing the human being standing before you, understanding their story, and recognizing that circumstances aren't always black and white. The irony hit him like a physical blow. Here he was, co-author of these words, yet he hadn't fully practiced what they'd written about. In his courtroom, he had seen Sarah Thompson as just another case number, despite her explanation about her mother's emergency. 3 years, Sarah continued, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of disappointment. For 3 years, we've been writing partners. We've created characters who fight against prejudice, who learn to see beyond their initial judgments. Our books have won awards for their sensitive handling of racial issues in the justice system. And yet, Michael set his coffee down, his hands slightly shaking. And yet, when you stood before me in that courtroom, I didn't demonstrate any of the principles we write about. I didn't truly see you. A group of conference attendees walked past their table, their excited chatter about publishing deals creating a stark contrast to the heavy conversation taking place. Sarah waited until they passed before responding. You know what's really interesting, she said, closing her laptop. When we were writing online, you never once asked about my race, my gender, or my background. You judged me solely on my ideas, my writing, and my understanding of human nature. But in that courtroom, I fell into the same patterns we criticize in our books. Michael finished for her. The realization made him feel physically ill. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. The same intelligent eyes that had seemed challenging in his courtroom now held a mixture of disappointment and curiosity. So, Judge Harrison, what happens now? Do we continue our writing partnership, pretending this never happened? Do we walk away from 3 years of successful collaboration? Or do we find a way to turn this unexpected situation into something meaningful? The questions hung in the air between them, as heavy as the humidity on the Chicago summer day. Through the glass walls of the rooftop garden, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across their table. The conference badge around Michael's neck suddenly felt too tight, the dual identity of judge and writer becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Their latest manuscript sat open on Sarah's laptop, the cursor blinking at the end of a chapter about redemption and understanding. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had become characters in their own story, facing the very issues they wrote about. The next morning, Sarah and Michael met in a quiet corner of the hotel's restaurant for breakfast. Both had spent a restless night thinking about their situation. A plate of untouched pancakes sat between them as they tried to navigate their new reality. I've been reviewing our past conversations, Michael said, scrolling through his phone. Over 3 years, we've exchanged thousands of emails about justice, fairness, and equality. Yet when it mattered most in real life, I failed to practice what we preached. Sarah stirred her coffee thoughtfully. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the tired lines around her eyes, evidence of her own sleepless night. You know, yesterday evening, I went through some of our old manuscript drafts. Remember how we argued about that scene where our protagonist, Judge Carter, realizes his own prejudices? Michael nodded, remembering the heated email exchange. You pushed for him to face his biases directly, while I wanted to make his journey more gradual. And now here we are, Sarah said, living out a similar scene in real life. She pulled out a small notebook, the kind she always carried for writing ideas. But this time, it's not fiction. This is about real people, real consequences, and real pain. The breakfast crowd moved around them, unaware of the heavy conversation taking place in their corner. A waitress refilled their coffee cups, and Michael waited until she left before speaking again. Yesterday, after our meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about every case I've handled, he admitted, his voice lower and less certain than his usual judicial tone. How many times have I claimed to be completely fair while carrying unconscious biases? How many stories did I fail to truly hear? Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. Let me tell you something about that day in your courtroom. When I walked in, I was already preparing myself for what might happen. Do you know why? She paused, making sure she had his full attention. Because as a black woman, I've learned to expect certain treatment, even from people who consider themselves fair and unbiased. Michael felt the weight of her words. The pancakes between them grew cold, forgotten in the intensity of their conversation. That hospital form I showed you, Sarah continued, was completely valid. My mother really did need emergency surgery. In our books, we would have written that scene differently. The judge would have shown more understanding, maybe reduced the fine or dismissed the case entirely. But I didn't, Michael said quietly. I handled it like any other case, thinking that's what fairness meant. A group of conference attendees walked past their table, their excited chatter about book signings creating a stark contrast to the serious conversation taking place. Sarah waited until they passed before continuing. You know what's interesting? She said, opening her notebook. In our writing, we create these moments of revelation where characters learn and grow. But in real life, these moments are much messier, much more uncomfortable. Michael watched as she began writing something in her notebook. What are you doing? Taking notes, she replied, not looking up. Because whether we continue our partnership or not, this experience is too important to ignore. This is the kind of real-world complexity we try to capture in our books. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across their table. Michael noticed how Sarah's hand moved steadily across the page, just as it had done countless times while revising their manuscripts together. You're right, he said finally. This is messy and uncomfortable, but maybe that's exactly why it's important. In court, I see everything in terms of laws and regulations. But you, through our writing, you've always pushed me to see the human stories behind the laws. Sarah looked up from her notebook, meeting his eyes. The question is, Judge Harrison, are you ready to really see those stories now? Not just in our books, but in your courtroom. Because this conversation isn't just about one traffic ticket or one chance meeting. It's about the entire system we both work in, you as a judge, me as a writer exposing these issues through our novels. Their coffee had grown cold, much like the forgotten pancakes, but neither seemed to notice. They were too absorbed in this crucial moment, where fiction and reality had collided in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Later that afternoon, Sarah and Michael found themselves in the hotel's quiet library, away from the busy conference halls. The wood-paneled room, filled with leather-bound books, created a fitting backdrop for two writers about to have the most important conversation of their partnership. Before we begin, Sarah said, settling into a deep armchair, I want to share something with you. She pulled out a worn notebook from her bag. This is where I kept track of every court appearance I've had to make over the past 10 years. Michael sat across from her, his judicial posture softening as he noticed how thick the notebook was. Sarah opened it, revealing neat handwriting and dated entries. Speeding ticket, 2015. Judge assumed I was lying about being late for a job interview. Parking violation, 2017. Officer wrote me up while ignoring an identical violation from another car. And now, 2024, running a red light while rushing to see my mother in the hospital. She looked up at Michael. Do you notice a pattern? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library windows as Michael studied the pages. Each entry included not just the violation, but detailed notes about how she was treated, the assumptions made, and the outcomes. These aren't just traffic violations, he said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. These are documented experiences of bias. Sarah nodded, the same bias we write about in our books. Remember chapter 12 of our last novel, where the young lawyer faces repeated dismissal in court despite her credentials? We based that on reader feedback, Michael said. But this, he gestured to the notebook, this is your real life. A library cart squeaked past them, the elderly librarian giving them a quiet smile. They waited until she passed before continuing their conversation. You know what's ironic? Sarah said, pulling out her laptop. The day you find me in court, I was actually working on revisions for our new book's courtroom scene. She opened a document and turned it toward Michael. Look at what I wrote that morning. Michael leaned forward to read. The weight of justice isn't just in the laws we uphold, but in the humanity we recognize in each person who stands before us. My words, he whispered, remembering their joint editing session. Your emotions. Exactly, Sarah said, closing the laptop. Every emotional scene I wrote, every character's frustration with the system, it came from somewhere real. From experiences like the ones in this notebook. The library had grown quieter as the afternoon wore on. Through the windows, they could see conference attendees hurrying to various sessions, their badges bouncing as they walked. I need to ask you something, Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine curiosity. How did you maintain such professionalism in our writing partnership, knowing that the system I represent has treated you this way? Sarah took a moment before answering, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. Because I believed in the power of our stories to create change. Every judge who reads our books, every lawyer who sees themselves in our characters, that's a chance for understanding. But now the judge in your stories turns out to be just as biased as the ones in your notebook, Michael said quietly. Yes, Sarah agreed, but here's the difference. She leaned forward, her voice carrying a note of hope. You're sitting here, having this conversation. You're willing to listen, to learn, to face uncomfortable truths. That's more than any other judge in this notebook has done. The library lights automatically switched on as the natural light faded, creating a warm glow around them. Michael picked up Sarah's notebook again, this time reading the entries more carefully. Each of these incidents, he said, represents a moment where the system failed you, where I failed you. He looked up at her. How do we move forward from here? Sarah reached for the notebook, but didn't take it from his hands. Instead, she opened to a blank page. Maybe we start by writing a new entry. One where a judge and a writer sit in a library, having the kind of honest conversation that could change them both. The clock on the library wall ticked softly, marking this moment of potential transformation. Outside, the conference continued, but in their quiet corner, two partners were rebuilding their understanding of each other, one difficult truth at a time. The second day of the writers' conference was drawing to a close when Sarah and Michael met in the hotel's empty conference room. Their laptops sat open between them, displaying the manuscript of their upcoming book. The room still held traces of the day's activities, scattered papers, empty coffee cups, and the lingering excitement of literary discussions. We need to make a decision, Sarah said, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Our publisher expects the final draft in 3 weeks. The question is, are we still a team? Michael glanced at their shared screen, where their latest novel waited for revisions. The story suddenly felt different to him now, every word carrying new weight, every character's struggle more real than ever before. Before we decide, he said, pulling up their original writing contract, I want to acknowledge something. Our partnership has never been equal, has it? While I wrote about justice from the comfort of my chambers, you wrote from lived experience. Sarah adjusted her reading glasses, a habit Michael had noticed she did when thinking deeply. You're right, but that's exactly what made our books powerful. We brought different perspectives to the same truth. The evening janitor peeked in, but seeing them still working, quietly closed the door. The sound of the vacuum cleaner in the hallway created a soft background noise to their important conversation. Look at this scene, Sarah said, scrolling through their manuscript. Remember how we argued about this part, where the young black defendant tries to explain his circumstances to the white judge? Michael nodded, remembering their lengthy email debate. I insisted that the judge's response was realistic. You pushed for. His voice trailed off as realization hit him. You pushed for what you wished had happened in real courtrooms. Including yours, Sarah added quietly. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago evening skyline. The question isn't just about finishing this book, Michael. It's about what happens after. What do you mean? He asked, though part of him already knew. Sarah turned back to face him, her silhouette framed by the city lights behind her. If we continue writing together, things have to change, not just in our stories, but in real life. I can't write about fair judges with you while experiencing unfair treatment in actual courtrooms, even yours. The weight of her words filled the room. Michael closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. What are you proposing? A new kind of partnership, Sarah said, returning to her seat. One where our writing influences reality, not just the other way around. She pulled out a fresh document and began typing. I propose we use our platform for more than just entertainment. The screen filled with her ideas. Speaking engagements about bias in the justice system, workshops for judges and lawyers, a blog about their journey from courtroom confrontation to meaningful collaboration. You're talking about exposing ourselves, Michael said, reading her words. Sharing our story. Exactly, Sarah nodded. No more hiding behind pen names. No more pretending these issues don't exist in real life. We use our experience, this unexpected meeting of judge and defendant turned writing partners, to create real change. Michael watched as she continued typing, her passion evident in every word. He thought about his courtroom, about all the Sarah Thompsons who had stood before him, their stories unheard or dismissed. It would mean admitting my biases publicly, he said slowly. Facing criticism from other judges, maybe even risking my reputation. Yes, Sarah agreed, stopping her typing. Just like I've risked rejection and dismissal every time I've walked into a courtroom. The difference is, this time we face it together, purposefully, for something bigger than ourselves. The room had grown darker, with only their laptop screens providing light. Outside, the conference was winding down, but for them, something new was just beginning. Our publisher won't expect this, Michael said, finally breaking the silence. A judge and a defendant, turning their accidental meeting into a movement for change. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since their rooftop revelation. Sometimes the best stories are the ones we never planned to tell. They looked at their manuscript again, both knowing that whatever they decided would change not just their professional relationship, but potentially the lives of countless others who would read their story and see themselves in its pages. 6 months after the Chicago Writers' Conference, Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in the National Judicial Conference, facing a room full of judges. Judge Michael Harrison sat in the front row, his presence both supporting and symbolic. The large conference hall was packed, with every seat taken and people standing along the walls. When I walked into traffic court that day, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. I was just another defendant to the judge. Today, I stand before you as a best-selling author, sharing a story that changed not just 2 lives, but an entire perspective on justice. The audience sat in rapt attention. Many had read their latest book, Blind Spots, A Judge's Journey, which had hit the bestseller list 3 weeks ago. The book wasn't just another legal thriller. It was their real story, expanded to address the larger issues of bias in the justice system. Judge Harrison and I could have walked away from our writing partnership after that courtroom encounter, Sarah continued, gesturing toward Michael. Instead, we chose to use our experience as a catalyst for change. Michael watched from his seat, remembering their difficult decision to go public with their story. They had faced criticism from some quarters, judges who thought he was betraying the bench, critics who called it a publicity stunt, but the impact they were having made it all worthwhile. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing statistics they had gathered over the past 6 months. These numbers tell a story of their own, she said. A story of how small biases create large inequities in our justice system. The presentation continued, but Michael found himself thinking about how much had changed. Their publisher had initially balked at their decision to change direction, wanting them to stick to fiction. But when they shared their story on a small legal blog, it went viral. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hear about the judge and the defendant who became partners in advocating for change. After Sarah's presentation, they took questions from the audience. A young judge raised her hand. How has this experience changed your approach to the bench, Judge Harrison? Michael stood up and turned to face his colleagues. Every person who comes before me now gets what I call the Sarah Thompson test, he said, earning a knowing smile from Sarah. I asked myself, what if this person is more than what I see? What if they're someone's writing partner, someone's inspiration, someone's hope for justice? The questions continued for another hour. Some were challenging, others supportive, but all showed that their story had struck a chord. During the break, judges approached them with their own stories of realizing and confronting their biases. Later that evening, Sarah and Michael sat in the hotel restaurant, reviewing notes for their next presentation. Their laptops were open, displaying drafts of their upcoming book. this time a non-fiction work about transforming the justice system. Did you see Judge Rodriguez's reaction when you mentioned the traffic court incident? Sarah asked, typing quickly. I think we found our next workshop facilitator. Michael nodded, still processing the day's events. It's amazing how many judges came up afterward, wanting to start similar programs in their districts. A waiter brought their dinner, and they paused their work. The restaurant buzzed with conference attendees, many discussing the day's presentations. They could hear snippets of conversations about bias training, community engagement, and judicial reform. You know what's different about today? Sarah said, putting down her fork. When I spoke at the conference this morning, not one person questioned my right to be there. 6 months ago, I couldn't even get a fair hearing in traffic court. Michael smiled, remembering how far they'd come. And now we're teaching other judges how to recognize their own blind spots. Their phones buzzed simultaneously, an email from their publisher. The early reviews of their book were coming in, and they were overwhelmingly positive. One reviewer had written, "This isn't just a story about a judge and a writer. It's a wake-up call for our entire justice system." Sarah read the review aloud, then looked at Michael. Did you ever imagine, when you find me that day, that we end up here? No, he admitted, but I'm glad we did. We're not just writing about justice anymore. We're helping to reshape it. Through the restaurant window, they could see other conference attendees heading to evening sessions. But for them, the real work was happening right here, in these quiet moments of planning and purpose, where their unlikely partnership continued to grow into something much bigger than themselves. 1 year after that fateful traffic court appearance, Judge Michael Harrison's courtroom looked very different. Gone was the stern, by-the-book atmosphere. Instead, there was a new energy, one of understanding and true justice. On this particular morning, he sat in his chambers, reviewing a letter that had just arrived. Dear Judge Harrison and Ms. Thompson, he read aloud to Sarah, who sat across from him. Your story has inspired our state's judicial board to implement mandatory bias training for all judges. Your book is now required reading for new appointees. Sarah smiled, remembering their journey. And to think, it all started with a traffic ticket and a blue scarf. The chamber walls, once decorated only with legal certificates, now displayed framed copies of their books, including their latest bestseller. But more importantly, there were photographs of community meetings, judicial training sessions, and testimonials from people whose lives they had touched. Court begins in 10 minutes, his clerk announced, poking her head in, and the journalism students are here for their observation project. Michael nodded, adjusting his robes. This was another change they had implemented, regular court observation by law students, journalism students, and community members. Transparency, they had learned, was a powerful tool for transformation. Ready for another day of real justice? Sarah asked, gathering her materials. She now regularly sat in on his court sessions, taking notes for their ongoing research and writing. The courtroom was full when they entered. Beyond the usual defendants and lawyers, there were students with notebooks, community observers, and even a few judges from other districts who had come to learn from their new approach. All rise, the bailiff called out, but Michael quickly gestured for everyone to sit. In this courtroom, he announced, as he did every morning now, we rise not just for the law, but for justice and understanding. Every person here deserves to be heard, truly heard. Sarah took her usual seat near the front, opening her notebook. Their latest project was documenting the impact of their reformed courtroom practices. The statistics were impressive: lower repeat offender rates, increased community trust, and better outcomes for all participants in the justice system. The first case of the day involved a young man who had missed his probation meeting. In the old days, Michael would have immediately issued a violation. Now he asked questions, listened to the story about unreliable public transportation and a sick child. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, but Michael raised his hand. Before we proceed, he said, let's understand the whole picture. He turned to the young man. Tell me about your challenges, and let's figure out how we can address them while keeping you in compliance. Sarah watched as the scene unfolded, taking notes. This was what they had been writing about all along: justice tempered with understanding, law enhanced by humanity. During the lunch break, they met with a group of visiting judges who were interested in implementing similar changes in their own courtrooms. The key? Michael explained, is recognizing that every person who stands before you has a story. Your job isn't just to judge the action, but to understand the context. And sometimes, Sarah added, that person might even be your future writing partner. The room filled with knowing laughter. Their story had become legendary in legal circles. As the afternoon session began, Michael looked around his transformed courtroom. The walls hadn't changed, the law books were the same, but everything else was different. Each case now got the attention it deserved, each person the respect they needed. At day's end, Sarah and Michael sat in his chambers, reviewing their notes. Their next book was taking shape, a practical guide for transforming courtrooms across the country. You know what the best part is? Sarah said, looking up from her laptop. We're not just writing about change anymore. We're living it, creating it, spreading it. Michael nodded, thinking about all the lives they had touched. From that moment of uncomfortable recognition on the rooftop garden to this, we've come a long way. Outside his window, the sun was setting on another day in their transformed courtroom. But for them, it was more than just a workplace now. It was a beacon of hope, a model for change, and a testament to what could happen when two unlikely partners decided to turn their moment of conflict into a movement for justice. The traffic ticket that had brought them together sat framed on Michael's wall, a reminder that sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest moments. And as they packed up for the day, both knew that their work, their partnership, and their impact were far from over.